Sonia Shah is one of the premier scientific journalists of our times writing in English in our country. And I think we're quite fortunate this evening to have her kick it off before we go to the panel. And I can give you the standard blurb, right? She wins prizes, that's what good scientific journalists do. She gets published in major venues, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, Scientific America, the places that the intellectual discussions on issues of importance are actually read and debated. But in addition to being a journalist, she's also an author of multiple books, and I've actually used her books quite a bit in my teaching thing, and I'll comment on how I use your books and whatnot. And I encourage you not only to pay attention to the new book on cholera that's coming out, but to go back and take a look at the fever, which was Sonia's attempt to basically tell the story of why malaria has been with us for 500,000 years and probably will be for the next 500,000 years, in my opinion. But also earlier than that, did a really fascinating piece of investigative reporting on the drug industry and how we test drugs. And for people who don't know all the way back, the Body Snatchers book is, I think, an important, Body Hunters book. I got my movies and my books mixed up, are all worth your time. And at the end of the day, really, there is so much to read and so much to know that being selective in what we choose to read is important. But I'd actually like to do the introduction a little bit differently and say, what is it that we expect from our scientific journalists in these times? And I'd like to argue that we expect three things. We expect a voice with insight. And it's quite interesting that I'm an Ohio boy. I didn't realize she was an Oberlin graduate. I'm a big fan of Oberlin, except for when they played Kenyon in soccer, or my daughter is a D3 soccer player. So with the exception of that day, I'm a big fan of Oberlin, but I'm even more so a fan of somebody who chooses to study neuroscience, philosophy, and journalism. Right, which is a very interesting sort of mixture of things to be trained in. And that multidisciplinary training actually, I think, prepares one for the second key thing, which I'm interested in from our scientific journalists, which insight you have to have. Tell me something that I need to know that's important. But I think Sonia's strength has been, through her writing, she's been a voice of presenting alternative truths. Whether you go back to the Body Hunters work or you go back to the malaria work, she has a critical eye to offer a different perspective on some of the social phenomena that we see around us. And I think that's a real contribution to have the courage to offer alternative truths into the public domain. But lastly, I think the real power of it, and this comes to my use of the work in my teaching, is it's a fabulous exercise in challenging what I call the known. Everything you think you knew, read Sonia's work and you may have to rethink some of it. And I think that's a real contribution. So for her insight, for her providing alternative versions of the truth or perspectives on the truth, and for challenging her work, I think that's what defines a premier scientific journalist. I'll close by saying I actually use the fever, Sonia. And I use it for three different audiences, interesting enough. When I teach my undergraduate honors class, we read the fever because it's an exercise in complexity for 18 and 19-year-olds. But I also use the fever for my public health history course, for my MPH students, because then it's a very critical review of the global malaria response. In addition to being a challenging book on trying to understand complexity. But the most fun use of the fever, the third audience that I presented it to and asked them to read, was I had the privilege of being the global team leader of the review of the President's Malaria Initiative, PMI. And Tim Zimmer and I read your book in a book club, which was really fun to read it with Tim Zimmer, who is the leader of the President's Malaria Initiative and his staff. So I've been a big fan of Sonia's for a while. I've used her work. Up until tonight, I had not had the opportunity to meet her, but I'd like to call her forth to the podium to ask her to address the next challenging thing, which is cholera with a note of appreciation for what you've contributed so far and what we look forward to you contributing going forward. Thank you.
Well, that was just lovely. Thank you. Usually when people introduce me, they just read what I write on my website, just read the bio. So that was really just so nice. Thank you. This is taped on. Can I untape this? AV person? Yeah, okay. Good. I don't like standing behind it because I'm kind of short. So this project, the reporting and research that went into this project was actually part of research I've been doing for a new book. It's called Cholera's Child, and it's about tracking the next pandemic. That's sort of the subtitle. And the reason I wanted to look at pandemics was because in the last 50 years, about 300 infectious diseases have either newly emerged or reemerged into new places where they've never been seen before, like Ebola in West Africa right now. In surveys, some 90% of epidemiologists say that we're going to face a disruptive pandemic sometime within our generation or the next generation. So I was interested in looking at, well, how does a pathogen become a pandemic, right? So what are the political drivers, the social drivers, the economic drivers that make a microbe turn into a pandemic? And I wanted to look at cholera in particular because out of like a handful of pathogens that have caused pandemics, cholera really, it stands alone. It has caused 7 pandemics since it first emerged in 1817. So it came out of South Asia during a time of colonization of the tropical wetlands there, spilled over into people, and has basically just been ravaging the world nonstop since then. The 7th pandemic is now, with us today in Haiti and elsewhere. So the Mapping Cholera project in particular looks at 2 outbreaks that kind of punctuate the whole process, the whole global history of cholera causing pandemics in human populations. The 1832 epidemic in New York City and the 2010 epidemic that started in Haiti 4 years ago, right around this month. And we were very excited to be able to map these outbreaks. To tell the story through maps was really exciting because, of course, cholera has this long history with mapping. It was in 1854 in London that an anesthetist named John Snow, he mapped an outbreak of cholera that had occurred around the Broad Street well. And by creating that map, he proved for the first time that cholera was carried in contaminated water. And he's also considered the father of epidemiology for actually creating that map. So we were very excited when I found this data from 1832. And the New York Public Library actually had recently geocoded 19th century maps, which made mapping this data possible. And it was really exciting because, of course, the 1832 outbreak precedes John Snow's outbreak by 22 years. So that was really cool, too. So I just want to tell you the story of these 2 epidemics really briefly. And I'm pulling these images from the Mapping Cholera website and app, which I encourage you all to look at. It's got a lot more detail than I can show right here tonight in this brief presentation. So New York City in 1832, it was a newly industrializing city, booming population, booming economy. The Erie Canal had just been opened. It was opened in 1825 actually, so it was 7 years old. And the Erie Canal completely changed the economy of New York City. Before that, the other port cities had more traffic, had more of the shipping trade, Boston, Philadelphia, et cetera. And the Erie Canal changed that. It made New York City the premier port city in the nation because not only was it receiving sort of the transatlantic shipping trade, but now through the Erie Canal, it's receiving all this trade from the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River and the interior of the country. So it really changed the fortunes of the city. And it also made it a lot more vulnerable to introductions of new pathogens. So, of course, a lot of people were coming into the city at that time through, the rural people were coming into the city, and people were coming from overseas, Ireland, Germany, Italy, all these places were sending a lot of people into into Manhattan to settle. And of course, there wasn't any fast trains to take you from the ports to the outlying areas. So everyone had to live right near where the work was, or where the possibility of work was. So the southern tip of Manhattan became incredibly crowded. And one of the most notoriously crowded places was a slum called 5 Points, and that's highlighted in white on this map. This was actually a slum that was built on a pond. It was the only freshwater source of drinking water in the island of Manhattan when it was first settled. It was filled up with garbage, and a slum had been built on top of it, tenement buildings, and this became the 5 Point slum. It's one of the most crowded places on earth at the time. No one had ever lived in such crowded conditions really before. There were 77,000 people per square kilometer living in 5 Points, and compare that to about 700 to 1,200 people per square kilometer in Monrovia today, or Freetown in West Africa. So there was really no room to sprawl, and of course, as the city got more and more crowded, the sanitary conditions degraded accordingly. There was no sewer system to carry away people's waste and put it somewhere safe where it could degrade without contaminating people's food and water. People basically used privies or cesspools, which were in their basements, and these would be allowed to basically fill up and sink down into the ground or spill out into the streets. If people had money, they might hire the night soil men to come dig out the contents of their privy vaults, and those night soil men would basically just carry it over to the piers and dump it right off the piers into the Hudson and the East Rivers. In fact, it was so bad sometimes boats that were moored in the rivers would actually sink because they'd get, these horrible loads would get dumped upon them. So all of this human waste was really contaminating a lot of the ground of the city of Manhattan, and also the surface waters. And this meant that the groundwater was rapidly contaminated with human excretion. The people drank the groundwater because there wasn't really anywhere else on the island to get drinking water. They had shallow wells, that were about 30 feet deep. These were on all the city corners, and that's where people used that water for domestic purposes. There was one company actually that had been chartered by the state of New York to distribute water through a series of pipes to the people of New York. And that company chose to sink their well in the middle of that slum, amidst all the privies and cesspools of the tenements there. And they distributed that water to 1/3 of the people of Manhattan. And that company actually is called the Manhattan Company. Has anyone heard of the Manhattan Company? Okay, so you might know then that they still are around today. It's actually J.P. Morgan Chase. So they survived despite distributing contaminated water for many years to the people of New York. So the shipping trade first brought cholera over in 1832. It had come out of South Asia in 1817. Took a while, took a couple decades to spread across the old world in the bodies of soldiers and traders on foot. Got to Paris and London in 1832, explosive epidemics happened. Very rapidly came over the Atlantic on the packet ships that were new at the time. Erupted in Montreal and Quebec City, and then started coming down the Erie Canal, heading towards New York City. And the governor of New York State knew that this was happening. He sent a physician to track cholera. What was happening in Canada? Was the cholera going to come to New York City? And we actually mapped the data that the government doctors collected at that time, and it clearly shows that cholera was indeed coming down the Erie Canal, heading straight for New York City. But they didn't want to disrupt the economy. Nobody really knew how cholera spread. So they said, no, we don't need to disrupt trade. We don't need to quarantine. It's really just the immigrants who are getting sick. It's really just the poor people and the drunks, so we don't have to worry about it. So the people of New York, as cholera was encroaching upon them, did things like burn barrels of tar to ward off the disease instead. And as you can see from the map that we were able to create, excuse me. Where's the thing? Oh, I see the mouse, right. Sorry. Gonna go? Yeah, okay. So the epidemic started along the waterways. I think it's going to replay, so you might be able to see it better. And people fell into the rivers, they got sick, started spreading it to other people. And you can kind of see once it hits the 5-point slum, it just erupted across the city. And the government of the city continued to deny the epidemic, even as it was happening. The mayor denied there was any cholera in the city at all. The Board of Health, which at that time were elected officials, so they were basically the cronies of the mayor, they denied there was any cholera at all. So it was the physicians, it was the frontline workers who were dealing with all of these sick people who actually collected the addresses and the outcomes of all the people who got sick at that time to kind of show this is happening. People are actually dying, and they wrote down who was dying and where. And that is the data that we actually use to map this epidemic. By the end of it, about 6,000 New Yorkers had gotten sick with cholera, and nearly 3,000 had died. So fast forward 178 years to Haiti, 2010. Cholera has by now, it's on its 7th pandemic, so it's gone around the world a bunch of times. New York City, of course, the last cholera epidemic happened in 1866. And the rest of the nation, we continued to have cholera right up until the turn of the century, when clean water supplies and good sanitation systems were installed. But meanwhile, 400 kilometers off the coast of Florida, 19th century conditions still continued in places like Haiti. So in Haiti in 2010, 1/5 of the population of the capital city, Port-au-Prince, had access to latrines. 4/5 of the people of Port-au-Prince had no access to even latrines. They had to use wherever they could find, open lots, ditches, stream beds, etc. There's very little potable water available in the city. There is a piped distribution system of water, but it's widely understood to be not drinkable unless you treat it. So most people get water from tanker trucks, and they bring their gallon cans and fill up at tanker trucks. So it's conditions of real water scarcity, and it's very difficult to keep up the kind of hygiene levels that you need to avoid a disease like cholera. So January 2010, magnitude 7 earthquake hits Port-au-Prince. 300,000 people die. 1 million people are made homeless. 10 months later, the United Nations is training soldiers in Kathmandu, Nepal. There's a cholera outbreak going on in Kathmandu at that time. Those soldiers are not screened for cholera. They're put on a plane and they come to Haiti, and they settle in a camp that they had built above the Artibonite River, which is the biggest river in Haiti. Reporters actually documented, and there's actually videotape of this, the raw sewage coming out of that UN camp being dumped directly into a stream that fed into the Artibonite River. And within a few days of the arrival of those soldiers into that camp, there was hundreds of cases of cholera across the delta of the Artibonite River. Within a year, there was more cholera in Haiti than anywhere in the world combined. And I can show you that if I can figure this out. I'm trying to use the mouse. Oh, there it is. It's off the screen, so I can't. Is it gonna play? Oh yeah. Okay, there it goes. Okay. So this explosive outbreak happens in Haiti, and there was a similar kind of government secrecy in a way in this outbreak too. The United Nations refused to acknowledge that it was their own soldiers who had introduced cholera into Haiti. Cholera hadn't been seen in Haiti in over 100 years. So people there were completely naive to it. And this provoked a lot of mistrust. There was violent clashes between local people and UN camps, and there were riots, and a lot of times this spilled over into attacks on cholera treatment centers. So it really complicated the attempts to actually treat the disease. And once again, it was the people on the front lines who were the best at documenting this epidemic. It was Doctors Without Borders who, with the help of Google, and one of our panelists, Pablo, is going to tell us about how that happened, were able to get GPS data on all of the cases that they treated. And they had to do that because they didn't have enough resources to treat everyone. So they had to know where we needed the most, right? So they had to track the epidemic so they could better serve the population with the limited resources they have. Even though MSF has a lot of resources, it wasn't enough. And so this epidemic, of course, continues to this day, 4 years on. The infrastructure that would be required to get rid of cholera in Haiti has not been built. And probably until that happens, we're going to keep seeing cholera in that country and that epidemic continue. Since it started, there's been 700,000 cases of cholera in Haiti, and nearly 8,000 people have died. And this is a bonfire that sends up sparks, right? Just like the Ebola epidemic is a bonfire that sends up sparks. So cholera has spread out of Haiti into Dominican Republic. It has spread to Puerto Rico, to Bahamas, to Cuba, to central Mexico. Drug runners brought it into the middle of Mexico, probably. It's come into Florida. We've brought it through our flight network into England, into Germany. And this is what we see. This is going to keep going until we can get epidemics like this one and like similar ones under control. So I really look forward to the Q&A. Hope you all stay, and the panel discussion is going to be fabulous. Thank you so much.